Standing 6'9" and weighing over 300 pounds of pure intensity, Sidney Raymond Eudy was one of the most physically imposing figures professional wrestling has ever produced. Whether you knew him as Sid Vicious in WCW, Sid Justice in the WWE, or Sycho Sid during the Attitude Era, one thing was always abundantly clear to anyone who crossed his path. This man was absolutely not someone you wanted to cross. Not in the ring, not backstage, and definitely not in a hotel bar at 3 in the morning. Today we're diving deep into the 5 most explosive moments when Sid Vicious lost control outside the scripted world of professional wrestling. These are real incidents, verified by multiple eyewitnesses and sources, that left careers damaged, bodies bloodied, and the entire wrestling industry shaking its collective head in disbelief. Wrestlemania 8, April 5th, 1992. The Hoosier Dome in Indianapolis, Indiana. Over 62,000 fans packed into the arena to witness what was being billed as potentially Hulk Hogan's final match in the World Wrestling Federation. The Hulkster was riding off into the sunset, or so we were told, and his opponent for this momentous occasion was the man who had betrayed him earlier that year, Sid Justice. Now, before we get into what happened during the match and why it matters, you need to understand the full context of this situation, because it involves politics, drug tests, and one of the most protected finishers in wrestling history. At this point in wrestling history, Hulk Hogan's running leg drop was the most protected finishing move in the entire business. The original plan for the WrestleMania 8 finish was straightforward and designed to protect everyone involved. Hogan would hit the leg drop on Sid. Before the referee could count to 3, Papa Shango, played by Charles Wright, who later became the Godfather in the Kama Mustafa, would run down that long WrestleMania aisle, slide into the ring, and break up the pin. This would cause a disqualification, giving Hogan the technical victory while keeping Sid looking strong because he never actually got pinned. Simple, clean, classic wrestling booking. But something went wrong. Something went very, very wrong. Papa Shango missed his cue. Gorilla Monsoon, the legendary wrestler-turned-announcer who was working as an agent backstage, gave Shango the signal to start heading to the ring. But by the time Shango started making his way down that incredibly long WrestleMania aisle, through the crowd, and toward the ring, Hogan had already hit the leg drop and made the cover. Earl Hebner was counting. The finish was happening without the interference. And that's when Sid Vicious did something unprecedented, something that sent shockwaves through the wrestling world. Something that had never happened before in WWE history. At the count of 2, with Papa Shango still nowhere near the ring, Sid Justice kicked out of the leg drop. You could see the confusion ripple through the entire arena. Referee Earl Hebner looked completely lost, unsure of what was happening. The crowd didn't know how to react because they'd been conditioned for years to understand that the leg drop meant the match was over. This simply wasn't supposed to happen. Nobody kicked out of Hogan's leg drop. And now, Sid had become the first person in WWE history to do exactly that, on the biggest stage of all, at WrestleMania. Harvey Whippleman, Sid's manager, recognized the chaos unfolding and quickly improvised. He jumped into the ring, giving Earl Hebner a reason to call for the disqualification. The bell rang. Hogan was announced as the winner. Papa Shango eventually lumbered to the ring, leading to a 2-on-1 attack on Hogan that was saved by the shocking return of the Ultimate Warrior, making his first WWE appearance since SummerSlam, 1991. Crisis averted, right? The show went on. The Warrior's return gave fans something huge to talk about, but behind the scenes, people were asking questions. What the hell just happened? Did Sid do that on purpose? Here's where the story gets interesting, and where multiple competing versions of events start to conflict with each other. The most charitable interpretation, and the one that became the official story, is that Sid improvised brilliantly under pressure. Papa Shango was late, the planned finish wasn't going to work, so Sid had no choice but to kick out to keep the match going until Shango could arrive. Quick thinking, smart wrestling. Sid deserves credit for saving the finish from becoming an even bigger disaster. That's one way to look at it, but there's another version of this story, a much darker version that paints Sid in a very different light. Bruce Pritchard, the longtime WWE producer and agent who worked closely with the company during this era, has confirmed on his podcast that Sid failed a drug test before WrestleMania 8. The WWE knew about it. They were going to suspend it. But because the match was already heavily advertised, and they'd sold tens of thousands of tickets partly on the strength of this main event, they allowed Sid to compete at WrestleMania. The suspension would come after the show and the subsequent European tour. Some people believe that Sid, knowing he was already on his way out the door, knowing he was going to be suspended regardless of what happened, decided to go into business for himself. If you're getting punished anyway, why not kick out of the most protected finisher in wrestling history? Why not make yourself look like a monster who could survive Hulkamania itself? What were they going to do? Fire him twice? Suspend him harder? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Papa Shango was definitely late. Sid definitely had to improvise something to save the finish. But whether he was secretly pleased to get that opportunity to defy expectations and make himself look stronger at Hogan's expense, only Sid knows for sure. And Sid has never definitively clarified his intentions. What we do know with certainty is what happened next. Sid was supposed to move into a major program with the Ultimate Warrior, picking up from where Warrior's return left off. It should have been a huge money feud, but after wrestling Warrior at a couple of house shows, including one in Boston, Sid abruptly quit the company. His reason for quitting? He was furious that the Ultimate Warrior had been booked to kick out of his finisher, the powerbomb. Sid felt it made his move look weak and devalued him as a performer. The irony here is almost too perfect to be real. Sid was upset about someone kicking out of his finisher, weeks after he had just kicked out of Hogan's finisher at Wrestlemania. He apparently saw no contradiction whatsoever in his position. When he kicked out of someone else's finish, it was brilliant improvisation. When someone kicked out of his finish, it was a burial that demanded he walk out on the company. This incident reveals a pattern with Sid that we'll see repeated throughout this list. When things didn't go exactly his way, when he felt slighted or disrespected in any capacity, he was willing to burn bridges spectacularly. He didn't care about the money he was walking away from. He didn't care about the fans. He didn't care about his colleagues who were counting on him. Sid's ego came first, always. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. Softball? How does missing wrestling shows to play recreational softball count as snapping? Where's the violence? Where's the drama? Where's the blood? Bear with me here, because while this one doesn't involve scissors or squeegees, it reveals something crucial about Sid's psychology that would manifest in much more dangerous ways as his career progressed. This is about a man who had zero regard for professional obligations, zero respect for the fans who paid money to see him, and zero filter when it came to prioritizing his own desires over everything else. Throughout his entire career, from his early days in WCW through his multiple runs in WWE, Sid developed a reputation that followed him like a shadow. It was whispered in locker rooms from coast to coast. It became a running joke among wrestlers, promoters, agents, and everyone else who had to deal with him professionally. The accusation, and it was one that persisted for decades, was that Sid Vicious, one of the highest-paid main event talents in professional wrestling, would routinely no-show scheduled events to play in local softball leagues. Not miss shows because of injury. Not miss shows because of family emergencies. Miss shows because he wanted to play softball with his buddies back home. Jim Ross, the legendary WWE announcer who also served as a top executive responsible for talent relations, has confirmed this on his podcast multiple times over the years. According to JR, Sid had a stronger passion for softball than he ever did for wrestling, and that passion played a huge part in him mysteriously being absent from a handful of house shows throughout his career. This wasn't an isolated incident or two. This was a pattern of behavior that drove promoters absolutely crazy and had agents scrambling to explain to paying audiences why the advertised main event star wasn't there. Think about this from a business perspective for a moment. You're running a wrestling company. You've spent money advertising Sid Vicious as appearing at a house show in Tulsa or Toledo or wherever. Local fans have bought tickets specifically because they want to see this monster in person. They've arranged babysitters, they've taken time off work, they've driven hours to the venue. And then Sid just doesn't show up because there's a softball game happening back in Arkansas that he'd rather attend. The stories got more elaborate and frankly, more absurd as time went on. In one particularly ridiculous incident that became infamous in wrestling circles, an independent promotion called AIW booked Sid for an appearance. They promoted it heavily. They sold tickets on the strength of his name. And then Sid no-showed. But here's where it gets truly wild. The promoter later leaked a phone call revealing the excuse Sid gave for missing the event. Are you ready for this? Sid claimed that Donald Trump's travel ban prevented him from flying to the show. The problem with this excuse? There were absolutely no restrictions on Americans flying from one state to another within the United States. Sid just completely made it up, apparently expecting that nobody would question him on it. The audacity is almost admirable if it wasn't so disrespectful to the fans and the promotion. WrestleCon, one of the biggest wrestling convention gatherings during WrestleMania weekend, had similar problems trying to work with Sid. They booked him for their event and even planned to name a celebrity softball game after him, calling it the Sid Vicious Softball Invitational. Pretty cool tribute, right? All they asked in return was for Sid to provide a simple promotional video confirming his appearance. Just look at a camera, say you're coming to WrestleCon, done. 30 seconds of effort maximum. After 4 months of requesting this basic video, Sid still hadn't delivered. 4 months. They eventually had to pull him from the event entirely, telling fans via Twitter that he simply couldn't do this for us. WrestleCon also reminded everyone that Sid had previously no-showed their event back during WrestleMania 33 weekend in Orlando. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was who Sid was. What makes this a snapping moment? What earns it a place on this list is the way Sid prioritized his own desires over professional obligations with absolutely zero concern for consequences. Other wrestlers would face career-ending blacklisting for this kind of behavior. You miss a show without a legitimate excuse, you're done. Word spreads. Nobody books you again. Your career evaporates. Sid? He just kept getting hired. Because despite all of this, he was too physically impressive, too valuable as a draw, too capable of making companies money to ignore. Promoters would sigh, curse his name, and then book him again anyway because they knew he'd sell tickets. Now, in fairness, Sid has defended himself over the years. He claims the softball stories got blown wildly out of proportion by people who were jealous of his success. According to Sid, he only played softball during legitimate injury recovery periods when he wasn't cleared to wrestle anyway, and that Jerry the King Lawler, who also played recreational softball, actually snitched on him to WCW management out of professional jealousy. Sid claims Lawler saw him at games during his time off and reported back to the office, trying to make trouble. Whether you believe Sid's defense or not, one thing is absolutely undeniable. His unpredictability and complete refusal to conform to professional norms was a recurring theme throughout his career. And as we'll see with our upcoming entries, this same disregard for expectations and consequences would manifest in much more violent and dangerous ways. Speaking of which, let's move on to number 3, where Sid's temper started showing its true colors. October 12, 1991. Atlanta, Georgia. WCW had just finished a house show at the famous Omni Coliseum, and in one of those rare coincidences that happens in the wrestling business, WWE was scheduled to run their own show at the exact same venue the very next night. This meant that wrestlers from both major promotions were in the same city at the same time, something that rarely happened during the height of the Monday Night Wars and the fierce competition between companies. A group of wrestlers from both sides of the wrestling war gathered at the bar in the Ramada Plaza Hotel near the Atlanta airport. They were drinking, swapping stories, catching up with old friends who had gone to the other company. Among the WCW talents present were Brian Pillman, who was emerging as one of the most exciting performers in the business, and Mike Graham, the son of legendary promoter Eddie Graham and a legitimately tough amateur wrestler in his own right. Also present was Sid, who had recently jumped ship from WCW to WWE and was now working as Sid Justice in a high-profile program against Hulk Hogan. According to multiple eyewitnesses, including former WCW announcer Dave Penzer, who was actually in the bar that night, Sid started running his mouth almost immediately. He was bragging about how great things were in the WWE. He was talking about his push, his money, his position on the card. He was trash-talking WCW and everyone who worked there, calling them inferior and suggesting they were all stuck in a dying company while he was living the dream. Mike Graham, who had zero tolerance for this kind of thing and didn't care how big someone was, told Sid to shut the hell up. Graham was a legitimately tough guy, an accomplished amateur wrestler who could handle himself against anyone regardless of size differential. He wasn't intimidated by Sid's physical presence, and he made that crystal clear. But there was even more history complicating this situation. Sid and Brian Pillman had serious bad blood that predated this bar encounter. Earlier that same year, at WCW's Wrestle War pay-per-view in February, they had been in opposite corners of the War Games match. During that brutal cage match, Sid had powerbombed Pillman in a manner that many observers believed was intentionally dangerous. The cage ceiling was low, and Pillman's head made contact with the top of the cage on at least one of the impacts. Pillman was legitimately hurt. Sid later admitted in interviews that this wasn't an accident, but we'll get into that more in our next entry. So when Sid started insulting Brian Pillman at this bar in Atlanta, calling him a pretty boy who would never amount to anything in the wrestling business, telling him he was too small to be taken seriously, tensions exploded instantly. Pillman stood up, ready to fight. He'd been waiting for this opportunity for months. Now here's where the story takes a turn that nobody could have predicted. A turn that would follow Sid for the rest of his career. Sid backed down. This 6'9", 300-pound mountain of a man, faced with the prospect of actually fighting Brian Pillman and Mike Graham, backed down. He claimed he had recently torn his bicep and couldn't fight even if he wanted to. He literally pulled up his shirt to show them a bandage as proof of his injury. Then he left the bar, walking away from the confrontation. Everyone in the bar thought the incident was over. Tempers had flared, insults were exchanged, but Sid had left. They could go back to their drinks and their conversations. Crisis averted. They were very, very wrong. Sid went outside the hotel, his mind racing. He was furious. He'd been embarrassed. He'd backed down in front of everyone. He needed to save face. He needed a weapon to even the odds against Pillman and Graham. Something that would make them take him seriously. But it was late at night in a hotel parking lot. The nearby gas station was closed. There were no convenient weapons lying around. Sid searched desperately for something, anything that he could use. And then he found it. The perfect weapon for his revenge. A squeegee. Yes, a squeegee. The thing you use to wipe water off car windows at gas stations. The rubber and plastic implement designed for cleaning windshields. Sid Vicious, future multi-time world champion, main eventer of WrestleManias, armed himself with a squeegee. Sid burst back into the bar, squeegee held aloft like some kind of medieval weapon, and challenged Brian Pillman and Mike Graham to a fight. He was deadly serious. He thought this was going to intimidate them. According to Dave Penzer, who witnessed the whole thing, the reaction was not what Sid expected. Instead of fear, instead of backing down, everyone in the hotel lobby just started laughing. The sight of this massive man wielding a squeegee like it was Excalibur was simply too absurd to take seriously. People were literally pointing and laughing at him. Mike Graham, completely unfazed, walked right up to Sid, ripped the squeegee out of his hands, and told him he was going to shove it somewhere extremely uncomfortable if Sid didn't leave the premises immediately. Sid, now twice humiliated in the span of 15 minutes, stormed out of the bar for good. Bruce Pritchard later confirmed this entire account on his Something to Wrestle podcast, saying he heard the story directly from both Mike Graham and Brian Pillman over the years. The details were consistent. The squeegee was real, and Sid never lived it down. Sid, naturally, has his own version of events. He claims he was injured, outnumbered, and simply trying to defend himself. He claims Pillman was the aggressor who didn't want any part of a real fight with him. But the image of the squeegee has followed him ever since. It became an instant legend in wrestling circles, proof that sometimes the scariest-looking people aren't actually that scary when you stand up to them. The squeegee incident painted Sid as someone who could be intimidated, who would back down when confronted by genuinely tough men, and who made absolutely terrible decisions in the heat of the moment. It became a punchline that wrestlers would use for decades. But if you think a squeegee is a ridiculous weapon choice, just wait until you hear what happened 2 years later. Because Sid would upgrade his weapon of choice significantly, and the results would be catastrophic. We touched on this briefly in the last entry, but it absolutely deserves its own dedicated spot on this list because of how deliberate, how dangerous, and how morally reprehensible it was. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment outburst. This wasn't a bar fight that got out of hand. This was Sid Vicious, in the middle of a live pay-per-view broadcast, deliberately trying to injure a colleague because he was annoyed with him. February 24, 1991, WCW Wrestle War, the Arizona Veterans Memorial Coliseum in Phoenix, Arizona, with nearly 7,000 fans in attendance and many more watching at home on pay-per-view. The main event was a War Games match, one of the most brutal and prestigious match types in all of professional wrestling, featuring the Four Horsemen, Ric Flair, Barry Windham, Larry Zbyszko, and Sid Vicious, against the team of Sting, Brian Pillman, and the Steiner brothers. For those unfamiliar with the War Games format, let me paint you a picture. Two full-sized wrestling rings are placed side by side, with barely any space between them. The entire structure is then enclosed by a massive steel cage that covers both rings completely, with no way in or out once the match begins. Teams enter one at a time, with intervals between each entrance, until all participants are inside. The match can only end when one team either submits or surrenders. There are no pinfalls. There is no escape. It's designed to be violent, physical, bloody, and absolutely punishing on the human body. The 1991 War Games match at WrestleWar was, by all accounts, incredible. Dave Meltzer, perhaps the most respected and influential wrestling journalist in history, gave the match his coveted 5-star rating. A fan vote in the Wrestling Observer newsletter had 221 out of 227 respondents, giving the show a thumbs up. It was ranked as one of the highest-rated matches in Observer poll history at that time. This was genuinely great wrestling, but the finish would become notorious for all the wrong reasons. The planned ending saw Sid isolating the smaller Brian Pillman inside the cage and delivering repeated powerbombs until Pillman was unable to continue. El Gigante, the massive Argentine basketball player turned wrestler, would then appear at ringside and throw in the towel on behalf of the babyface team. It was a finish designed to make Sid Vicious look like an absolute monster, an unstoppable force of destruction. But there was a significant problem that Sid either didn't account for or didn't care about. The cage ceiling at this particular venue was lower than normal. When Sid lifted Pillman up for the powerbomb, the proper technique would have been to adjust his delivery, to bring Pillman down at a different angle to account for the reduced vertical space. Instead, Sid drove Pillman down with full force. Pillman's head made direct contact with the top of the cage on the way down before he crashed to the mat. It was a sickening impact that had fans gasping. Pillman landed in a crumpled heap, clearly hurt, clearly shaken, but Sid wasn't done, not even close. He picked Pillman up and did it again. Another powerbomb, another impact with the cage roof, another dangerous landing. Some accounts say there were actually 3 powerbombs, each one as reckless as the last. By the time El Gigante mercifully threw in the towel to end the match, Brian Pillman was legitimately unable to continue. This wasn't selling. This wasn't acting. He was genuinely hurt by what Sid had done to him inside that cage. For years afterward, there was debate about whether this was a terrible accident or something more intentional. Accidents do happen in professional wrestling, especially in high-impact matches like War Games where the environment is inherently more dangerous. Maybe Sid just didn't realize how low the ceiling was. Maybe he got caught up in the heat of the moment. Maybe it was an honest mistake by a performer who wasn't experienced enough to adapt on the fly. Then, years later, Sid himself settled the debate once and for all in a shoot interview. When asked directly about those powerbomb spots and whether they were accidental, Sid was blunt. His exact words: "That was done purposely. I sent him through the cage and had him hit his head. All the baby faces hated working with me in the Northeast because they got booed." He admitted it. On camera. Recorded for posterity. He deliberately endangered Brian Pillman's career, and potentially his life, because he was upset about getting booed in certain markets. Let that sink in for a moment. Sid justified nearly breaking a man's neck because fans were booing him. Not Pillman's fault. The fans were booing Sid because he was playing a heel and doing his job correctly. But Sid decided to take out his frustration on a colleague who had done nothing wrong except be in the ring with him. Sid went even further in explaining his twisted reasoning. He claimed that Pillman had been running his mouth backstage and refusing to cooperate with him on various issues. The dangerous powerbomb sequence was Sid's way of sending a message and establishing dominance. He wanted everyone to know that if you crossed Sid Vicious, there would be physical consequences. Think about how insane this is. This is professional wrestling. Your job, your fundamental responsibility as a performer, is to work with your opponent to create entertaining content while keeping each other as safe as possible. You're trusting each other with your physical well-being every single night. Sid's response to a verbal disagreement, to some backstage tension, was to deliberately try to hurt someone during a live pay-per-view broadcast in front of thousands of paying fans and countless more watching at home. This War Games incident is exactly why Brian Pillman was ready to fight Sid in that Atlanta bar 8 months later. Pillman hadn't forgotten what happened in that cage. He knew it wasn't an accident. He knew Sid had tried to hurt him. And when Sid started running his mouth and insulting him again, Pillman was more than ready to settle the score. Brian Pillman would go on to become one of the most innovative performers of his generation, pioneering the loose cannon character that blurred the lines between reality and fiction in ways that influenced wrestling for years to come. Tragically, Pillman passed away in October 1997 at just 35 years old. But the fact that he continued wrestling at a high level for years after what Sid did to him at War Games is a testament to his incredible toughness, his determination, and his love for the business. As for Sid, the War Games incident should have been a career-ending scandal. Deliberately trying to injure a colleague, then admitting to it on camera years later, is about as serious as it gets in professional wrestling. It violates every code the business has. It destroys the trust that makes wrestling possible. But Sid was too valuable, too physically impressive, too capable of selling tickets and drawing money. So the wrestling industry looked the other way, as it often does with its biggest stars. They wouldn't be able to look away from what happened next. Because 2 years after War Games, Sid would commit an act of violence so extreme, so bloody, and so nearly fatal that it changed the course of an entire wrestling company overnight. October 27, 1993. Blackburn, Lancashire, England. A moat house hotel in this working-class town in the north of England. This is the night that lives in infamy in professional wrestling history. This is the night that changed absolutely everything for everyone involved. This is the night Sid Vicious stabbed Arn Anderson approximately 20 times with a pair of scissors and nearly killed him. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not being dramatic for effect. This literally almost killed a man. WCW was in the middle of a grueling European tour, the kind of exhausting schedule that pushes even the most seasoned performers to their physical and mental limits. The wrestlers had been traveling for nearly 24 hours straight with minimal rest. They flew from the United States to the United Kingdom, got on a tour bus, drove for hours to a venue in Wales, wrestled a show, then got back on the bus and drove several more hours to their hotel in Blackburn. By the time they finally arrived in the early morning hours, everyone was exhausted, jet-lagged, sleep-deprived, and many of them had been drinking on the bus to pass the time. A group of wrestlers, including Sid Vicious, Arn Anderson, Big Van Vader, Too Cold Scorpio, and several others, gathered at the hotel bar to unwind and decompress before finally getting some sleep. Alcohol was flowing, tired minds were loosening, and the conversation inevitably turned to business, as it always does when wrestlers get together. Why was WCW struggling? Why weren't they drawing crowds like the WWE was? What was wrong with the product? Who was to blame for the company's problems? Ric Flair's name came up in the discussion, and that's when Sid Vicious made the critical mistake that would nearly cost Arn Anderson his life. According to multiple accounts from people who were present that night, Sid started loudly trashing Ric Flair. He called Flair an old man who needed to get the hell out of the way. He blamed Flair for holding back younger talent who deserved opportunities. He said the Four Horsemen were relics of a bygone era who were dragging the entire company down with their outdated ideas and backstage politics. The thing is, Sid probably forgot or didn't care that Arn Anderson was sitting right there. And Arn Anderson was Ric Flair's best friend in the world. They had been road partners for over a decade. They were brothers in every way that mattered. If you came for Ric Flair, you were coming for Arn Anderson too. Arn fired back immediately. He told Sid that he'd never drawn a dime in his entire life. He called him a big goof who was all look and no substance. He pointed out that Sid couldn't work, couldn't cut a real promo, and only had a job because he was tall. The insults escalated rapidly in both directions. Beer was thrown across the table. Other wrestlers tried to intervene and calm things down. Eventually, the bar had to close, and hotel security separated the combatants, sending everyone to their respective rooms. Most people assumed it was over. Tempers had flared, as they sometimes do when exhausted, intoxicated wrestlers argue about politics. Words were exchanged, but nobody got hurt. Everyone would sleep it off, wake up the next day, and move on like professionals. It happened all the time. But Sid wasn't done. Sid was never done when he felt he'd been disrespected. In his hotel room, Sid stewed. He replayed the confrontation over and over in his mind. He got angrier and angrier with each passing minute. The insults Arn had hurled at him burned in his memory. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't just sleep it off like a normal person. Finally, something snapped. Sid dismantled a wooden chair in his room, grabbed one of the legs as a weapon, and headed down the hallway toward Arn Anderson's room. What happened next depends entirely on which version of events you choose to believe. Both men have told their stories over the years, and they don't match at all. According to Sid's version, he knocked on Arn's door and called him out to continue their argument. When Arn opened the door, he was already holding a pair of scissors, apparently preparing to attack. Sid claims Arn lunged at him first, stabbing him in the stomach before he could react. Sid then fought back, got control of the scissors in the ensuing struggle, and defended himself against his attacker. According to Arn's version, he was in his room, possibly trimming his beard with the scissors, when Sid burst in without warning and attacked him with the chair leg while he was completely defenseless. Arn says he was knocked down immediately, possibly knocked unconscious for a moment, and only grabbed the scissors in a desperate attempt to defend himself against a man who had 6 inches and at least 80 pounds on him. What absolutely everyone agrees on is what happened next, because multiple witnesses saw the horrific aftermath with their own eyes. Too Cold Scorpio was staying in a room near Arn's. He heard the commotion in the hallway, the shouting, the sounds of a violent struggle. He stepped out of his room to investigate and was immediately confronted by a scene that looked like something from a horror movie. In his own words, describing what he saw, "I go down the steps and I see blood galore. Blood on the left, blood on the right, blood all down the hallway. I keep walking, and I'm in the hallway with a towel. I get down there, and Sid Vicious and Arn Anderson are down there just brawling. They were covered in blood. Sid Vicious got the scissors and got Arn Anderson by the hair, and he's booting him in the face, stabbing him with the scissors every which way. Arn Anderson had blood spitting out of him like a horror movie, man. Scorpio immediately jumped in to separate them. Vader, who was also staying nearby, arrived moments later to help break things up. Both wrestlers were physically pulled apart and prevented from continuing the attack. Arn collapsed against the wall, weakened from massive blood loss. Sid walked away in a daze, apparently not fully comprehending what he had done. Both men were rushed to a local hospital. The damage was absolutely catastrophic. Arn Anderson had been stabbed approximately 20 times in the chest and stomach. Some accounts say the number was as high as 28. Several of the wounds were dangerously close to vital organs. He suffered nerve damage in his left arm that threatened his ability to use his hand properly. He lost a terrifying amount of blood. The medical staff who treated him were reportedly shocked that he survived at all. Sid, meanwhile, had 4 stab wounds of his own, suffered during the struggle for control of the scissors. Both men were treated and stabilized, then deported back to the United States. The incident made national news, not just wrestling news. Police investigated, but no criminal charges were ultimately filed because both men declined to press charges against each other. The fallout for WCW was immediate and severe. The company had massive plans for Sid. He was scheduled to challenge Big Van Vader for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship at Starrcade in December, the biggest show on WCW's calendar. The promotional campaign was already in motion. Who's the man versus who rules the world? The two biggest monsters in wrestling history colliding for the world title. It was going to be huge. All of that evaporated overnight. Multiple wrestlers in the WCW locker room threatened to walk out if Sid remained with the company. They refused to work with someone who had just tried to murder a colleague. The locker room had finally seen enough of Sid's behavior, and this was the breaking point. Sid was fired immediately. The main event of Starrcade 1993 had to be completely rewritten on short notice. Ric Flair, the man Sid had been trashing in that hotel bar, replaced him in the world title match against Vader. In an incredible twist of fate, that hastily arranged match became one of the greatest in WCW history. Flair captured the WCW World Heavyweight Championship in an emotional victory that fans still talk about 3 decades later. If Sid hadn't lost his mind and stabbed Arn Anderson, that legendary moment would never have happened. The scissors incident became the defining moment of Sid's entire career, for all the wrong reasons. It followed him everywhere he went for the rest of his life. When he returned to WWE in 1995, they gave him the ring name Sycho Sid, which was widely understood as a deliberate ribbing of the Blackburn incident. Every single time an announcer called him Sycho, it was a reminder of what he'd done. Eric Bischoff, who was running WCW at the time, later spoke about the incident on his 83 Weeks podcast. Bischoff noted that neither man was completely guilt-free in the situation, acknowledging that Arn had been antagonizing Sid at the bar. But he also made clear that Sid was viewed as the aggressor who escalated a verbal confrontation into attempted murder. Turner Broadcasting executives wanted both Sid and Arn fired permanently, and it took significant political maneuvering to save Arn's job. Years later, remarkably, Sid and Arn reconciled. They've both spoken publicly about burying the hatchet and moving past that horrible night. Arn has said he doesn't hold grudges and that life is too short to carry that kind of anger. Sid has expressed regret about what happened, acknowledging that things went too far. But the scars remain, both physical and metaphorical. Arn Anderson carries the marks of those scissors wounds on his body to this day. The wrestling industry never forgot what happened in that hotel hallway. The scissors fight represents the ultimate, definitive example of Sid Vicious snapping for real. It wasn't a worked angle designed to sell tickets. It wasn't a publicity stunt that got out of hand. It wasn't a minor altercation that got exaggerated in the retelling. It was a violent, bloody, nearly fatal attack that happened because one man couldn't control his temper. Sidney Raymond Eudy, the man we knew as Sid Vicious, passed away on August 26, 2024, after a battle with cancer. He was 63 years old. His son Gunnar announced the news on social media, describing his father as a man of strength, kindness, and love. In the days and weeks following his death, tributes poured in from legends across the wrestling world. Triple H, Shawn Michaels, Booker T, Kevin Nash, and countless others shared memories and expressed their condolences. They praised Sid's impact on the business, his unique physical presence, and the undeniable charisma that made him a star. Like and subscribe for 100 years of luck. Until next time.